I would like to know how the wrestling mags back in the day were put together. How were the articles written? How were
like a ransom note? That's how they were put together.
How were the interviews done, or did they just make all the shit up?
Well, I mean, it depends on what magazine. And Norm Keitzer and Jim Melby at the Wrestling News and Pro Wrestling Enterprises up there in beautiful downtown Mankato, Minnesota, all the interviews were legitimate because they had their correspondents were fans. And like me, that was my first magazine that I got involved in. But their correspondents were fans and also the area photographers, but they would do legitimate interviews and they'd do, legitimate stories. Even though some stories were written as kayfabe, they would still have the reports of the territories and et cetera. All the newsstand magazines were all kayfabe, but then again, still even like Wrestling World. Especially in the 60s when old Lou Sahadi was there. They'd do legitimate interviews. Georgianne, Bruno's fan club president, Macropolis, and did a bunch of them back in the old days. The Stanley Weston magazines, which became known as the Apter magazines, because Bill Apter was the editor of the whole line for so long, they just made shit up just out of their ass. The interviews were made up, the quotes were made up, the headlines were made up, the angles were made up. They even made up, we talked about it a few weeks ago. They made up the story that Lawler beat Andre in the match. The match was the pictures of the match Mike Shields took here in Louisville. I was there also, and we saw the same match, and Andre won, right? But it made the story in the magazine, it made it better, and they just would take pictures to fucking illustrate what they came up with. And it was all written in kayfabe, and Bill's Apter has even said in his book that a few times he had to apologize for stuff that Stanley Weston had done because they crossed a line, and it was stuff that guys didn't like for one reason or another. But the guys got to trust Bill and his staff because it would all pass through Bill that they would make up stuff that furthered their angle or their gimmick or got them good publicity for the territory that they were in at that point in time. And mostly he did. And the apartment wrestling was foisted on them for so long there in the 70s or whatever. But they was all written, the writers would sit there and come up with interesting stories, and they'd have good pictures to go along with it. And because they had all the newsstand deals and were the widest distribution, all the guys wanted to be in the magazines, even if it was a made up shit. But it was made up shit about the opponents they were facing, or just to get them over, or to have people talk about them. And if you were on the cover, that was a big fucking deal. So, that's how they were put together. But that's the purpose they served, is to get guys over in gimmick as to who they were supposed to be. Of course, when you had a guy that was a raven babyface in one territory and immediately went back to where he was a despised heel in another, and the magazines were usually in those days between 8 and 12 weeks behind from the time that they actually put everything together and the time it went to press till the time that it hit the newsstand. That's how long it took back in those days. So sometimes there was a lot of overlap, and you'd go, why does that headline say so-and-so sodomized that baby puppy when he's over here kissing, children?
What magazine was that again?
Well, I think it was Inside Wrestler. It's August 76, the puppy sodomization episode. But anyway, yeah, that's kind of what happened back in those days.